Hey everyone, it's Heather Nichols, and today I have a card to share with you that I created with the Bold Branches stamp set to send your love to someone special. The main star of this card is the Clearly Crafty Bold Branches stamp set and the coordinating dies. I'll also be using the wood plank background stamp along with the stitched rectangle Stacklets dies. I'm using the smallest die in that collection. I'm using the Easy Strips 1/2 inch die, and then for ink I'm using Olive, Oreo, and Toffee. I'm using blender brushes. These are from the original set, and then I'll be using white acrylic paint, and I have a sponge brush here to apply it. I'm using foam squares and multimedia matte for adhesives, and then for an embellishment I'm using the white hearts in the Bits and Pieces Hearts pack. Finally, I'm adding splatters with Copic Opaque white ink, chocolate truffle liquid watercolor, and a water brush. To start out, I'm using the Bold Branches dies, and I'm cutting them from Avocado cardstock. My dies are still connected together, and that's actually really helpful when you're cutting out multiple shapes from that same die collection. I cut out 3 sets of branches, and you can do more or less depending on how full you want your frame to be on your finished project. I'm using Scotch removable tape to hold those dies in place on the cardstock, and then I'll send that right through my die cut machine. Next, I'm adding shading to the leaves using olive ink, and I'm applying that ink with a blender brush. I recommend having a light touch on the stems and leaves at the bottom of the branches because they are definitely a little more delicate. Once all of the leaves are shaded, it's time to stamp the branches. I'm setting up a template in my MISTI with the negative of the die cut. First, I'm putting my foam insert in because these are clear stamps, and then I will just secure that negative die cut in place. I'm using both my magnet and some removable Scotch tape. Next, I will add the stamps that I'm going to use for my frame into the openings of the negative die cut. I chose 4 of the branches to use for my project, and so I'll set those right into the spaces that they coordinate with. I'll close the lid of the MISTI to pick up the stamps, and then I will set the die cut pieces into the openings of my template. Next, I'll ink up the stamps with Oreo ink, and then close the lid of the MISTI to stamp the images onto the die cut pieces. You'll want to repeat these steps until you have all of your leaves stamped for your project. I'm adding splatters to all of the branches as well as a piece of Toffee cardstock. That's going to be my card background. I'm using Copic Opaque white ink and chocolate truffle liquid watercolor. I'll dip the brush into the color and then tap the brush over my finger to splatter the branches and the cardstock. Now I'll arrange the frame on the piece of Toffee cardstock. I'm starting out with the 3 largest leaves, and I'm arranging those in sort of a triangle formation around the card, and then I'll add a few leaves in between each of those large leaves, and I'll adhere these directly to the cardstock. I'm having all of the leaves come in from the edge of the card, and so there'll be kind of an opening or a space in the center of the card. Now I'm going to go around and add another layer of leaves. I'm first laying them out where I want them to go between the leaves that are already adhered to the cardstock. When I'm happy with how they look, I'm using foam squares to adhere this layer of leaves so that they're popped up just a bit to add extra dimension. When I need to, I'll use my scissors to cut the foam squares into smaller pieces so that I can fit them behind the different leaf sizes. When you're cutting foam squares into smaller sizes, do it while the paper backing is still there. That'll keep those foam squares from sticking all over your scissors. Once all of the branches are adhered, I'm using scissors to trim everything even with the sides of the cardstock. I want to stamp the sentiment on something that has a wood grain look, and so I'm adding white acrylic paint to a piece of Toffee cardstock. I'm applying the paint with a foam sponge brush, and I'm being really messy and streaky with how I paint it. You don't need your paint very thick. In fact, it will dry really quickly if you use a thin coat. I'm adding the piece of cardstock that I just painted into my MISTI, and then I will be stamping onto this cardstock with the wood plank background stamp. I'm just going to lay that stamp right over the top of my cardstock, and then I'll close the lid of the MISTI to pick up the stamp. There is adhesive behind my cardstock to hold it in place. I'm inking up the stamp with Toffee ink, and then I'll close the lid of the MISTI to stamp the wood grain background onto the cardstock. I added splatters to the panel just like I did to the branches a little earlier in this video. I'm cutting strips from the panel using the Easy Strips 1/2 inch die. I'll lay the die on top of the piece of cardstock, and then I will run that right through my die cut machine. To add extra definition to the wood planks that I just cut using the strips, I'm adding shading to the edges and ends with Toffee ink using a blender brush. I pieced the strips onto a small rectangle of cardstock, and I'm piecing them together to look like either a wood floor or like a wood wall. As I'm adhering the strips down to the cardstock, I'll use my scissors to cut the ends so that they're even with the edges of that rectangle base. Next, I'm cutting the rectangle out using the smallest die in the Stitched Rectangle Stacklets die collection. I'll adhere the die in place where I want it using a piece of Scotch removable tape, and then I'll send it through my die cut machine. To stamp the sentiment on the piece, I'll set that right back in my MISTI. I've got that foam insert back in to stamp with the clear stamps. I'll hold the piece in place with a magnet. I'll arrange the Love You sentiment from the Bold Branches set where I want it, and then close the lid of the MISTI to pick up the stamp. I'll ink up the stamp with Oreo ink and then close the lid to stamp the sentiment onto the piece. Now let's put this card together. I'm adding my panel with the leafy frame onto a sugar cube card base. Then I'll add the piece with my sentiment to the center of the card into the opening, and I'm using foam squares so that's popped up just a bit. And finally, I'm adding a few tiny white hearts right next to the sentiment. These are from the Bits and Pieces Hearts pack. I'm adding them right next to the sentiment, and I'll adhere them in place with multimedia matte. This card is done, and I hope you enjoyed learning how I created this leafy botanical frame using the Bold Branches stamp set. You can find all of the supplies that I used to create this card in the Tailored Expressions web store at tailoredexpressions.com. Thanks so much for joining me, everybody, and I'll see you next time.